Mick Cronin has made his headlines, of course, for calling out his players and getting crazy angry when his team is not having a lot of success. Well, now we sit here with UCLA having lost so many in a row, 4 in a row. They're what now, 11-6, 2-4 in Big Ten play. They haven't won a team game against a new Big Ten team since the new year. The Rutgers loss being the latest, most just heartbreaking one to watch, because that was a game I thought the Bruins could get back on track and win. No. And one of the big things I saw over the weekend heading into that Rutgers game was how even the College Game Day crew, which they have for college basketball and ESPN, Jay BILAS, head analyst, was out there critiquing, giving his thoughts, calling out Mick Cronin. So even some of the greatest minds, the biggest analysts, and the majority of the crew, like Jay Williams, like Seth Greenberg, Jay Williams, and Jay BILAS, all out there talking, hey, this was not the right move. And I talked in the most recent episode of Locked On UCLA where Cronin, when he calls out his players and has big-time tirades, can get the best out of his players in recent years, and it's led from success from 1920 into the 23-24 season, varying levels of success immediately. Well, since Cronin has called out his team, it's been back-to-back dismal performances. Now, there's a lot of off-the-court factors with this too, but even that crew also admitted, the game day crew talked about, hey, yes, they acknowledge that. But it seems like there is two sectors here. People who agree with Cronin, or the brightest, biggest minds who are like, Cronin spoke his voice, he is always going to do that, should have done that behind closed doors as opposed to going through the media to do that. And that's an interesting aspect, right? Where does hard coaching versus calling out your players draw the line? And now it's even a lot tougher because these are they're not amateur athletes anymore. They're making money. Like, they're making lots of money. All these players that came in, whether they were recruited, like the Trent Perrys, the transfers, they're making healthy NIL income for the most part, right? More than they ever would have been. The hype was, which I brought in and I contributed to the hype train, but a lot of people were with me, UCLA talking heads or such, that this team was going to be much better. They've proved it. They've got quite a few quad one wins already, where heading into the year, this team was already into the new year, was already NCAA tournament solidified. And I was like, if they don't collapse, they're guaranteed to be in the tournament. Well, they're on the brink of a collapse. And Cronin went out, used his magic idea of blowing up the team publicly through the media. And it has not worked so far. The game day comments I'm talking about, the Jay Bilases of the world, that was in between the Rutgers-Maryland game. And now they've tacked on another loss to that. What can UCLA do, hopefully with some home cooking, even though they're playing Iowa at home, and it's still necessarily a guarantee they can win that game, or being at home is going to resolve everything with what's going on in Los Angeles right now. There is so much turmoil for UCLA on the court that how are they going to fix it in practice, right? The defensive side of things, Cronin challenged their toughness. Well, there's something wrong between him challenging his coaching staff, his players, that he all brought in there, and it hasn't worked so far in these last 2 games. 2 tough road games, I'll admit, having to go all the way across the country, but some dismal performances on the defensive end in games where UCLA, if they don't give up 50 points and a half pretty much, remember, heading into the new year, UCLA gave up close to 55 points a game, and there's been multiple halves of basketball they've played this year in 2025 where they've almost given up what they give up per game in a single half, or it could have been more if the other team wanted to score more. That's been a big problem for UCLA. And the other eyesore is the playground offensive basketball that they continue to employ, they continue to run, and it's just not worked out. I know sometimes they're missing shots, they have to hit threes. It just doesn't always look like there's something in place with the Bruins playing on the offensive half. Like, what are they doing? I know I'm not a bright basketball mind, but even I can see, what do they run half the time? Sebastian Mack ISO for 30% of the game, is that always going to work? Now you need those guys who can attack and get to the bucket, but we saw how that worked last year. It didn't, at least not the whole time, or when Mac was successful, it got coached up and game planned for by the opponent, and Mac was less successful, although he did have the bad toe injury, for the rest of the year. And he doesn't shoot well enough to push the defenders too close to him where he can go blow past them, blow by them. They can sag off and help and force him to kick it out. And the Bruins, I think Cronin noted this after the Gonzaga game and into the Nebraska game, shot better than 40%, 42% or so from three. Because they can shoot. Don't compare these two teams from last year to this year. If you think this team is one of the worst shooting teams of all time, they are in a slump, but they are nowhere near last year's team in terms of shooting. They are much better. They have more players. They are better. What makes this so interesting is Cronin called out his team much louder because he knows this team has something. That is why he went to such extremes to call out the coaches, call out his players, because he believes this team is a lot more special than last year's team. He talked so many times about the 23-24 team that they need me. I need to coach them. They're young. They got to coach, got to truly coach. This is one of those years where Cronin doesn't succeed. He's pivoted multiple times on his recruiting strategy. He got the money this year, and if this doesn't work, that is kind of, all right, that seat's getting a little warm. I'm not trying to say something crazy here, but it isn't looking like the best situation if UCLA crumbles to finish and doesn't do the big things that were expected of them this year. Because they got the things that they didn't have last year, the NIL support. They got the players in the shooting, some defensive players, and it hasn't panned out. They've got some big wins. They got the quad one wins. You can't go in there and say this team hasn't proved anything. They've proved it. They got big wins over Arizona, at Oregon. Should have beat North Carolina, beat Gonzaga, and held them to under 70, where something's just wrong now. That is why Cronin went to such extremes to call out his team the way he did this early so they could figure it out. Now it's been a rough go at it right now for UCLA. Absolutely. Rough go of it. It was interesting timing after the Michigan game. Off the court, yes, but on the court, Michigan is just, again, a bad mismatch for UCLA. I'm glad they only played once because they played twice and had to go to Ann Arbor. I think Michigan would beat them by another 15 points. It's one thing in the postseason scenario, but if it was a regular season game in Ann Arbor, I think they would also beat UCLA again by 10 to 15 points unless the Bruins forced 25 turnovers, which they weren't doing against their 2 7-footers. It's a bad mismatch. But to question the toughness, the team hasn't shown up yet. And if it's staying at home for an extended stint, being on the West Coast for the next 2-3 weeks, that is hopefully what it means. Maybe it's not necessarily a win versus Iowa, but how everybody's called them out, it's now for the team to respond. From game day to the fans, you guys listening, even me just wondering, man, this team everybody's calling out, whether it's the play, Cronin, both, everything mixed in. It's time to respond. And with the Hawkeyes coming to town, playing SC, so they're already in California, and UCLA still recovering from being in the East Coast for close to a week and then landing, maybe they can figure out how this travel schedule works because they're on an NBA travel schedule. And Cronin has pushed them to the limit like a college coach with a big ego, with a big, loud, demonstrative personality, commanding the respect, trying to command the respect and the effort of his team, which hasn't come cohesively on the defensive side or the offensive side yet. They're still finding the right lineup, and nothing has worked. And the longer this goes on, the more the outcries, the louder the calls for Cronin's job will become. As asinine as it might have been a few weeks ago, it can turn in a second. But as Cronin always says, it's how you do in the NCAA tournament. And that is how we can save this second half of the season. The last third of the season and the postseason is how we can save it, and we can forget this 2 to 3 week stretch, hopefully. But in the moment, maybe the only one soft and delusional right now is Mick Cronin trying to get his team fired up. But until then, the Bruins have a lot of work to do.